I heard Mark James read a poem on Friday on the radio, an original poem called Rhythm. And I was so inspired that I thought I would start with a poem instead of what I had originally put in the program. So, the poem is by Thomas R. Smith, and it's called Trust. It's like so many other things in life to which you must say no or yes. So you take your car to the new mechanic. Sometimes the best thing to do is trust. The package left with the disreputable looking clerk. The check gulped by the night deposit. The envelope passed by dozens of strangers. All show up at their intended destination. The theft that could have happened doesn't. Wind finally gets where it was going, though the snowy trees and the river, even when frozen, arrive at the right place. And sometimes you sense how faithfully your life is delivered, even though you can't read the address. Food for thought. Now join me in singing our next hymn, number 134. Our world is one world. Please stand if you're willing or able. And it's number 134. Our world is one world. As I was thinking about the sermon for today, it occurred to me that it might be helpful to think about all of the changes that have happened at Beacon, and that it might be helpful to revisit some of the ideas that we presented in our workshops on the anatomy of trust, which were held in Beacon in January and October of 2018. And I know many of you attended one of those workshops. The Committee on Shared Ministry at the time, which was Drew Monroe, who's here, Colin Weller, Mark James, and myself, offered these workshops in response to a suggestion that was made by Sarah Millspaugh, who some of you I hope remember, our UUA district representative. And she's been assisting Beacon over the last 3 years in during Reverend Kevin's ministry. She suggested that we watch Brene Brown's TED Talk called The Anatomy of Trust. And we found the program so helpful that we thought it would be a good idea to share it with all the members of our congregation. And that's what led us to offer these workshops. We were delighted that nearly 30 members of the congregation showed up at the first workshop on the Anatomy of Trust on January 18th, 2018. After we viewed Brown's 22-minute video, and by the way, if you missed it, you can check it out on YouTube. Just type in Brene Brown Anatomy of Trust and it'll pop right up. It's about 22 minutes. We listened to the video and then we had a fascinating discussion about some of the ways that we trust each other at Beacon and some of the challenges that are posed to our trust, both by individuals that we may know, that we may have had issues about trust that are in the congregation, or trusting our institution, Beacon, as an institution. So one of the reasons that we wanted to have this workshop really was fulfilled by having a really enriching, interesting discussion about some of those challenges and prompted us, at least prompted me to start thinking about how we might work on some of those trust issues. We also offered the workshop again in October of 2018, and it attracted about 15. So I hope you will remember that one of the metaphors that Brene Brown uses is in her talk is that she says trust is like a marble jar. The marble jar that she was talking about is a jar that her daughter's teacher used in her elementary school classroom. And when one of the children in the class did something praiseworthy or followed the directions properly, she put a marble in the jar. And if one of the students did something naughty, or if the class was not behaving properly, she would take a marble out of the jar. And then she goes on to argue that when we have a positive experience of trust, we put a marble in our own personal marble jar. And when we feel that our trust is betrayed, we take a marble out. And then Brown goes on to define the components of trust. And you might remember this, I hope you do, if you were attending one of these workshops. She uses an acronym, BRADING, B-R-A-D-I-N-G. And this is what BRADING stands for. 1, B, boundaries. You respect my boundaries, and when you're not clear about what's okay or not okay, you ask. You are willing to say no. R, reliability. You do what you say you will do. At work, this sometimes means being aware of your competencies and limitations, so you don't overpromise and are not able to deliver on the commitments and balance competing priorities. A is for accountability. You own your mistakes, you apologize, and you make amends. V, vault. You don't share information or experiences that are not yours to share. I need to know that my confidences are kept and that you're not sharing with me information that someone has offered you that should be kept confidential. I, integrity. You choose courage over comfort. You choose what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. And you choose to practice your values rather than simply professing them. N, non-judgment. And I think this one is really significant. I can ask for what I need, and you can ask for what you need. We can talk about how we feel without judgment. Finally, generosity, G. You extend the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, or actions of others. And if you want a review of braving, Brene Brown has also written a book called Rising Strong, where she talks about these components. I think it's really easy to see how these apply to individual relations, but I wanted to sort of focus our attention today on some of the additional challenges that we faced here at Beacon in the last 6 months or so. And I found Brown's work to be really helpful. She's an innovative and astonishingly productive social science researcher. I don't know how many of you have ever read anything by Brown. And I encourage you to take a look at some of her books. One of them is Braving the Wilderness, which I'll talk about in a minute. She's been astonishingly productive. She holds an endowed chair at the University of Houston, and she is CEO of 4 companies that manage her talks, promote her books, advertise her programs that she designed, like the Daring Way and an intern program, and other activities. To date, she's published 6 books, 5 of which have appeared on the New York Times bestseller list. And her research mostly is on courage, shame, trust, vulnerability, and what she calls the gifts of imperfection. I wanted to focus on these last 3 concepts in my talk today because I think they offer a more positive way to think about some of the changes that have happened here at Beacon. Trust. How do you feel when you hear the word trust? I don't know about you, but it makes me uneasy. As many of you know, I was raised a Unitarian, but we moved to a very small town in northwestern Pennsylvania when I was about 9 and lived there until I went to college. And there was no UU church there. In fact, probably the nearest one was the one that our incoming minister, Reverend Zucker, where she has worked in Meadville, Pennsylvania. And that was probably the closest one to where we were living in this little tiny town. So I went to the Presbyterian church, and it was a pretty fundamentalist Presbyterian church. So when I hear the word trust, I hear the old hymn that some of you might know. It goes like this. Let me see if I can just sing a little bit of it. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. I hated that. And I've always had a problem with that kind of blind trust and obedience that is called forth in that hymn and in other religious contexts that I've experienced. It's one of the reasons that UU is so welcoming to me and feels much more comfortable. Brown offers a different way to think about trust in a religious context that seemed relevant to me and I hope to you. She was not raised, nor is she a practicing UU. She was born in San Antonio, Texas, on November 18th, 1965, so she's considerably younger than some of us. Her family moved to New Orleans, where she attended a Catholic elementary school, and later returned to Texas, where she attended the University of Texas, Austin, where she got her undergraduate degree, and subsequently went on to the University of Houston, where she got her 2 graduate degrees. She was brought up as an Episcopalian, attended Catholic services while she was going to that elementary school I mentioned. And she later returned to her Episcopalian roots and continues to attend services with her husband and her children. But she's not at all doctrinaire about her views of her own home church. And her ideas about trust, I think, are informed by her wide understanding of a lot of world religions, including Buddhism. I think, in other words, she fit right in at Beacon. In her 2015 book, Rising Strong, Brown explains, quote, "You will see that I don't believe faith and reason are natural enemies. I believe our human desire for certainty and our often desperate need to be right have led to this false dichotomy. I don't trust a theologian who dismisses the beauty of science, or a scientist who doesn't believe in the power of mystery. Brown's approach to social science research is a blend of qualitative and quantitative research methods. And one reason her books are so popular, I think, is that she writes in a much more popular style. Her books include lots of references to contemporary music, song lyrics, poetry, philosophy, art, and a curse word or two, which will come up in a later. But I think that her ideas about trust, vulnerability, and perfection are especially compatible with UU principles. The search for truth is, I think, one of them. Brown talks about trust as being a question that's directed a lot of her research. She asked, what do trusted leaders have in common? In Raising Strong, she writes, I kept asking myself, what do these people in strong relationships, parents with deep connections to their children, teachers nurturing creativity and learning, clergy walking with people through faith, and trusted leaders have in common? According to her research, the answer is clear. They recognize the power of emotion, and they're not afraid to lean into discomfort. I think it's easy to see how a lot of Brown's ideas apply to individual personal relationships, but how do they apply to Beacon as an organization? I began thinking about this topic about 6 months ago, and I started itemizing some of the additional ways that we have to trust this year, ways that we have to trust Beacon. 1, we need to trust the contractor will perform the remodel according to schedule, more or less, and the subcontractors that he works with. 2, we need to trust that all who have pledged their support to our stewardship campaign will fulfill their promises. We need to trust that people will supply the labor they promised, everything from assessing risk to painting. And we need to trust people's dedication to finding ways to lead us ahead. 3, we need to trust that those who have pledged to the capital campaign will complete their pledges in the time frame promised. 4, we need to trust our leaders here at Beacon, that they will continue to have faith in the future of Beacon. We need to trust that Beacon will continue to grow to make the best use of the space that we're going to add very soon. We need to trust the ministers we call to fulfill their promises, to work with people, even people they don't agree with. And we need to trust that we will find ways to benefit and improve Beacon in the coming years. And I know there are other things that you could add to that list if you just think about it. Brown goes on to argue that trust and vulnerability are related. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about our current moment. She defines vulnerability as, quote, uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Allowing ourselves to be vulnerable is worth the risk, she says, because, quote, what makes you vulnerable makes you beautiful. Vulnerability, she says, is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. And she says it's the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If you want greater clarity about the purpose, your purpose, or if you want to cultivate a more meaningful spiritual life, she says, vulnerability is the path. She describes in her earlier books, The Gift of Perfection and Daring Greatly, she describes these books as call to arms books, about having the courage to show up and be seen, even if it means risking failure, hurt, shame, and possibly even heartbreak. Why? Because hiding out, pretending, armoring up against vulnerability is killing us. Killing our spirits, our hopes, our potential, our creativity, our ability to lead, our love, our faith, and our joy. In other words, the more we try to armor ourselves against feelings, the more dangerous things become. She goes on to say, admitting vulnerability is not admitting failure. She writes, there's a vast difference between how we think about failure and how we think about the people and organizations that have been brave enough to share their failures for the purpose of learning and growing. Some of you may feel that someone at Beacon has betrayed your trust, or that some of Beacon's leaders have made decisions that you don't agree with. What do you do with those feelings? One way to think about them is to consider how and why these feelings make you feel vulnerable. And ask yourself, what positive lessons can you learn from recognizing and accepting these vulnerabilities and Beacon's vulnerability as a voluntary organization? I picked up Brene Brown's most recent book, Braving the Wilderness, because I thought it might help me develop this message and address what I know is something that many of us here at Beacon value, which is going out into the beautiful wildernesses that surround us here in Flagstaff. Unfortunately, that's not what she's talking about in this book. She doesn't mean wilderness in the literal sense. But so when I picked up the book, I found out that she uses wilderness instead as a metaphor. True belonging, she explains, is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. In this book, Brown also describes the larger national context that's making trust in individuals and institutions much more difficult in the United States right now. We are living in a country that is so bitterly divided into warring political factions. When we consider the effects of the national and international context in the last 6 months, it's clear to me that there are all sorts of new challenges related to trust. Can we trust our president? Can we trust our legislators to represent our views and find creative solutions? Can we trust the courts to interpret the laws accurately? Can we trust our elections? Can we trust our news sources, information reported on the internet, Facebook? I could go on, and I won't. You get my point. There's a lot of things that are impinging on and intensifying our sense of distrust. Brown concludes, we are divided from others in almost every area of our lives. We're not showing up with one another in ways that acknowledge our connection. Cynicism and distrust have a stranglehold on our hearts. And rather than continuing to move toward a vision of shared power among people, we're witnessing a backslide to a vision of power that is key to the autocrat's power over people. The results are not positive. As we take sides, lose trust, and get angrier and angrier, we are not only solidify an idea of our enemy, but we also start to lose our ability to listen, to communicate, and practice even a modicum of empathy. She concludes, when our belief that there's something greater than us, something rooted in love and compassion, breaks, we are more likely to retreat to our bunkers, to hate from afar, to tolerate bullshit, that's a direct quote, to dehumanize others, and ironically to stay out of the wilderness. She describes one way to get out of these bunkers is to find a corrective to the cynical habit, and find a corrective to these cynical habits of mind, is to show up regularly at face-to-face communal events, including services like this. She talks about the importance of attending funerals, live musical performances, religious services, where we are able to experience what Emile Durkheim describes as collective effervescence. I love that word. What comes when we gather and have, quote, an experience of connection, communal emotion, and a sensation of secretness. I hope that's one reason you came to Beacon today. For Brown, spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love. That is what we covenant each Sunday at Beacon, and it is the experience that all of us who stand up here in the pulpit hope to describe and celebrate. So how does perfectionism fit in? As I was trying to find a way into and out of the wilderness that Brown describes in this book, I happened to read an article that appeared in the spring 2019 UU World. I recommend it. It's by Nancy McDonald Ladd. The article describes her efforts to organize the Radical Justice Task Force in the UU congregation that she leads. She's a minister in Bethesda, Maryland. But her analysis, I think, applies it to other efforts that we take up as UUs as well. McDonald Ladd points out that UUs are often self-selected perfectionists. Sound familiar? Because of our, quote, historically high theological anthropology, our belief in the inherent goodness of human beings, our confidence in reason and self-culture, and personal rectitude. And she says that these attitudes set us up for failure. She notes, quote, liberal religious people not only tend to believe that they are called to perfection, but we also believe that we are already basically perfect, converted, and already basically blessed. At times, we like to imagine these things without allowing for further conversations that might impinge on our freedom to be exactly as we already are and to do exactly what we've been doing all along. How is perfectionism related to our vulnerability as UUs? McDonald Ladd explains, quote, because we've been taught that we were meant to be perfect, our lack of perfection brings a deep fragility to our spiritual lives and our partnerships for justice. This is, I think, why it is valuable to recognize our vulnerability and the difficulties of restoring or repairing our trust, not only as individuals, but also our efforts to restore our trust and faith in our leaders, our new minister, and our UU leaders at the national level. McDonald Ladd reminds us that, as Unitarian Universalists, we don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be God's own image to be worthy of continuing the work. And we don't have to be paragons of fearless virtue to deserve the simple grace of second chances. And I'm going to end with a quote from Gilda Radner. I wanted a perfect ending. Now I've learned the hard way that some poems don't rhyme, and some stories don't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. Life is about not knowing, having to change, taking the moment and making the best of it without knowing what's going to happen next. Mark, I think, will lead us now in yeah, thanks. Okay.
Our religious community is only as strong as the members and friends who dedicate themselves to its health and well-being. We ask any who come here seeking an open and welcoming community to give generously as you are able to ensure Beacon lives and remains strong and welcoming for all. And if you are a visitor today, please let the basket pass by. That song reflects back to probably many of our youthful days, more youthful days, but it's a great song. George Winston, I think, composed it. That's certainly where I heard it. Today, and for the 4 Sundays of January, this is an old script. We were in July, so there is our community partner who the extra funds will be going to, and that's on the back of your order of service. On the first 4 Sundays, all designated cash or checks over $300 will be presented to that special group. And Tom,